There's a horse outside of Millhaven that no rope has ever held twice. They say it broke a man's wrist in January, shattered a fence post in February. By March, it had run 3 ranchers off their own land, men who'd worked cattle since before they could read, men who didn't spook easy and didn't back down from much. Nobody could explain it. Nobody wanted to get close enough to try. But here's the thing about a mystery that keeps hurting people. Eventually, someone decides the answer is worth the bleeding. Cale Duren wasn't looking for purpose when he followed that horse into the hills. He was just tired of watching good men flinch. What he found up there didn't just explain the horse. It changed everything he thought he understood about anger, about grief, about who we decide to call dangerous and why. This is that story, and I promise you, by the end of it, you won't look at a wild thing the same way again. I keep a small journal. Have since I was 19 and my uncle died on a cattle drive outside of Tucson and nobody wrote down a single word about how it happened or what kind of man he was. Just gone. No record. Like the land swallowed him and didn't bother to remember. After that, I started writing things down, not because I thought I was important, but because I figured somebody ought to be paying attention when the rest of the world wasn't. That habit has got me in trouble more times than I can count. You notice things when you're always watching, and the more you notice, the harder it gets to look away. My name is Gideon Marsh. I am 34 years old. I have a scar above my left eye from a branding iron accident in 1881, and for the better part of 2 weeks in the spring of 1884, I was more afraid of a horse than I have ever been afraid of anything with 4 legs and a heartbeat. That's where this begins. The first time I heard about the roan, I was sitting in the back corner of Hannigan's feed store in Millhaven, Texas, waiting on a sack of oat bran and trying to stay out of the noon heat. Millhaven wasn't a large town, maybe 200 souls if you counted generously, 3 streets of real commerce, a church with a leaning steeple, and a reputation for hard winters and harder people. I drifted through twice before, liked the quietness of it, and ended up hiring on at the Kiever Ranch on the south edge of town about 6 months prior. Not glamorous work. Fence mending, mostly, some cattle moving. I was good at solitude, and the Kievers seemed to respect that. The 2 men in front of me at the counter were Pete Dunbar and a rancher I didn't know by name. Older man, maybe 60, with one arm wrapped in a sling made from flour sack cloth. Dunbar was talking loud enough that I couldn't have ignored him without plugging my ears. "Second time it's come down off the ridge," Dunbar was saying. He was a thick man built like a water barrel, always a little red across the nose from sun or drink or both. Crossed right through the Harmon property at a full charge. Harmon tried to cut it off and it put him on the ground. Shoulders dislocated, I heard. The older man in the sling made a sound somewhere between a grunt and a confirmation. "That's the 3rd rancher this month." "4th," Dunbar corrected. He said it with a strange kind of satisfaction, like being accurate about injuries was its own form of currency. "Lyle Custer got knocked off the fence on the east side pasture 2 weeks back. Ribs. Nobody counted him because he didn't want to admit a horse done it." "What in God's name does it want?" Dunbar shrugged. "Nothing, that's the thing. It don't eat the cattle feed, don't go near the stock tanks. Just comes down, charges whatever man it finds, and goes back up." I wrote that down in my journal right then. Just a line, roan horse. Comes down off the ridge, charges men, no clear motive. I didn't know it yet, but that line was going to multiply into pages. I asked around over the next 3 days. Carefully. I wasn't a gossip by nature and didn't want to be seen as one, but I had a talent for listening that people sometimes mistook for being agreeable, and Millhaven was a town that liked to talk when it was scared. What I pieced together was this. The roan had been spotted on the eastern ridge for the better part of a year. Before that, nobody could say where it came from. It was a big animal, not thoroughbred tall, but thickly muscled, the kind of build that comes from rough terrain and hard living rather than careful breeding. Dark reddish-brown with a coat that looked almost russet in certain light. 1 white sock on the left foreleg, no brand, no saddle scars that anyone had noticed. For a long time it was just there, a wild horse on the ridge. Nobody paid it much attention. There were a handful of wild horses in the hill country east of Millhaven, descendants of stock that had broken loose decades ago, and most folks considered them scenery. Then sometime around the previous October, things changed. The first incident had been written off as accident. Dale Morrow, who ran a small spread closest to the base of the ridge, said the roan had come through his property at a dead run and knocked him off his feet while he was repairing a water trough. He figured he'd startled it. Easy enough explanation. The second incident was harder to explain away. A man named Clyde Reese, fixing a stretch of fence on his northeastern pasture, had watched the roan come down the slope at a deliberate, measured trot, stop about 30 yards from him, stand still for nearly a full minute while Reese held absolutely motionless, and then charge. Full run, straight at him. Reese had scrambled over the fence, and the horse had hit the post hard enough to splinter the second rail, then turned and walked back up the ridge like nothing had happened. Reese was a man who didn't rattle. He'd told the story twice, and both times he'd said the same thing. It looked at me first. It knew exactly what it was doing. After that, incidents stacked up. Men working near the eastern pastures developed the habit of watching the ridge. Some started carrying rifles when they worked that stretch. Old Ben Prout, who'd been ranching since before the war and had seen just about everything, told his 2 ranch hands to avoid the ridge-adjacent pastures entirely until someone figured out what was happening. Nobody had figured out what was happening. What bothered me, and I wrote this down too, was the specificity of it. The horse didn't bother women. It didn't charge horses. It didn't knock over livestock or raid feed stores. Every single incident involved a man working alone in open land near the base of the eastern ridge. Every single time it came from above. Every single time it went back up after. That wasn't random animal behavior. Random animal behavior is scared and scattered and inconsistent. This was something else, and I didn't have a word for it yet. Cale Duren came into my awareness on a Thursday, which I remember because Thursdays were when I rode the southern fence line for the Keevers and had the longest stretch of solitary time to think. I'd come back in at dusk and found him sitting on the water trough near the barn, talking to old Keever in that easy, unhurried way some men have, the kind of manner that makes you feel like time isn't actually moving and you don't need it to. He was lean, somewhere around 40, with dark hair gone silver at the temples and a face that had been weathered into something almost geological. Deep-set eyes, gray-brown, the color of creek stone. He wore his hat pushed back off his forehead in a way that made him look perpetually surprised by whatever he was looking at. And he had a habit. I noticed it immediately, because that's what I do, of running his thumb along the inside of his belt whenever he stopped talking. Just a small loop of movement, like his hands needed something to do while his mouth was resting. His name, I learned over supper, was Cale Duren. He'd ridden in from the northwest, out of Abilene originally, hired on as a temporary hand for the spring count. Keever liked him. Keever was not a man who liked people quickly. The topic of the roan came up before the meal was half over. It always came up. Millhaven didn't have enough subjects for a dinner table to avoid it. "Heard about it in town," Cale said. He wasn't boastful in the way some men are when they want to seem knowledgeable. He said it plain. "Also heard nobody's been up on that ridge to actually look around." "Nobody wants their ribs broken," I said, and then immediately felt embarrassed, like I'd been too direct. I had a tendency to do that, say something blunt and then wish I'd built up to it more. Cale looked at me, just looked. The thumb-on-belt movement stopped. "Something's driving that horse," he said. "Horses don't just decide to hate a specific category of human for no cause. Something happened to it, or something's happening up there." Mrs. Keever, who had not been part of the conversation, said quietly from the kitchen doorway, "People have said there used to be Apache up on that ridge, before the army pushed them further east." Nobody answered her. It hung in the air between us the way things do when they're important but inconvenient. I wrote it down that night. Something happened to the horse, or something is happening. Cale Duren, thumb on belt, former Apache land. I want to be clear about what Millhaven thought of the Apache in those days, because it matters to understanding what came next. This was 1884. The last major conflict in that region was fading. Victorio's war had ended in 1880. Geronimo was still a name that made women pull their children inside and made men check their firearms, but the violence was mostly gone from this particular stretch of Texas. What remained was something harder to define, a residue of fear that had calcified into contempt, the way milk left out too long stops being something you can use and becomes something you have to clean up. The ranchers of Millhaven didn't talk about the Apache with fear anymore. They talked about them with a kind of aggressive forgetting, the way you talk about a problem that you've decided is solved and don't want to revisit. Words I won't repeat here, but that were said regularly and without embarrassment. A sense that the land was theirs now, had always been theirs, and that anything preceding their ownership was just prehistory, like rock formations or dry river beds. Natural features, not history, not people. I didn't share that view, but I was careful about saying so. I was a hired hand in a small town with a reputation for self-sufficiency and a low tolerance for outside opinions. I kept my disagreements in my journal. But it meant something that Mrs. Keever had said what she said. It meant something that she'd connected the horse to that history. And it meant I was watching Cale Duren more carefully after that, trying to understand what he was thinking. He didn't say anything else about the horse for 4 days. I worked beside him during that stretch, fence repair mostly, and moving a portion of the cattle herd to the spring pasture. He was good company in the way that quiet, capable people are good company. He didn't fill silence with noise, but the silence beside him wasn't uncomfortable. He whistled sometimes while he worked. Old songs I didn't recognize. He knew horses with the kind of intuitive fluency that looks like magic to people who don't have it. I watched him gentle a young mare that had been spooking at fence shadows all morning, and it was less like training and more like conversation. He stood close without crowding. He breathed slow. He waited. On the 5th day, he came and found me at the water trough, where I was writing my evening notes. "I'm going up on the ridge tomorrow morning," he said. "Early, before anyone else is working the eastern pastures." I looked up at him. "You want company?" I asked. He looked at me for a moment, doing that thing with the thumb. "Can you be quiet when it matters?" "Yes," I said. "Then yeah," he said, "come on." We left before dawn. I mean that almost literally. The sky was still that deep ink blue that's not quite night and not quite morning when we rode out of the Keever yard, following the eastern road with our horses moving quiet in the cool air. I had my journal in my inside breast pocket, which is where it always rode. A stupid comfort, like a child with a blanket, but I'd stopped apologizing for it. Cale didn't talk much on the ride. I didn't push. The horses moved well together, which felt like a good sign. The eastern ridge was more substantial up close than it looked from town. From Millhaven's main street, it was just a low line of hills, tan and scrub-covered, undramatic against the Texas sky. But riding toward it in the dark, the ground rising gradually under us, it got bigger in the way that things do when you stop looking at them from a comfortable distance. The scrub thickened. The path, there wasn't really a path, just a ghost of one, the kind that forms when animals and people have been going the same direction for a long time. Wound up through clusters of cedar and live oak, the rocky soil showing through in patches where rain had washed the top layer down the slope. We tied the horses to a cedar stand about halfway up. Cale said it without explaining why, and I trusted him enough not to ask. We went up the rest on foot. I was breathing harder than I wanted to admit by the time we crested the first ridge. The sun was just beginning to separate the sky from the horizon to the east, a thin orange line still provisional like it hadn't committed yet. Cale stopped. I stopped beside him. He didn't speak, he just looked. I looked too. And then I saw it, and I understood at least part of it, and I reached for my journal before I even made a conscious decision to. The roan was there, not 50 yards off, standing in a clear space between 2 rocky outcrops, absolutely still in the gray pre-dawn light. Closer, it was even larger than the descriptions had suggested. The musculature was extraordinary, the kind of animal that looks like it was made by someone who was building something meant to last. The russet coat was dark with dawn shadow. The white sock caught what light there was. But the horse wasn't what stopped me. It was what was around the horse. The clearing it stood in was not a random clearing. There was a shape to it that you recognized even if you hadn't been told what to look for. The remnant lines of something that had been there and was no longer. The kind of negative architecture that land makes when human life has been pressed into it for a long time and then removed. A flattened area where a structure had stood. A ring of stones, blackened, that had once been a fire circle and nothing had disturbed since. A rusted iron piece half buried in the earth that might once have been a hinge. Scraps of something, I couldn't tell what from distance, tucked into the base of one of the outcrops. Apache, my brain said, before my mouth could form the word. This had been a camp, or a home something. The roan stood in the middle of it in the early light, and it stood like it was standing guard. Cale put his hand on my arm before I moved forward, not gripping, just resting, a signal. We watched. And then something happened that I still have trouble writing about even now, months later, sitting in the warmth of the Kiever bunkhouse with the journal open on my knee. A sound came from the far end of the clearing. Low, rhythmic, not an animal sound or not only that. And from the shadow of the larger outcrop, a figure stepped into the early light. A person. She was Apache. I knew it before I knew anything else about her. The dark hair, the clothing, the way she moved without announcing herself, like someone who had learned that visibility was a luxury you couldn't always afford. She looked small against the horse and the rocks and the pale, enormous sky, and she looked old. Not elderly, not frail, but the kind of old that is made of specific losses rather than accumulated years. She was speaking to the horse. That was the sound. Words in a language I didn't know, low and continuous, the way you talk to something you've talked to for a long time and no longer need to frame carefully. The roan turned its head to her. It blew out a long, slow breath. She reached up and put her hand on its face. And Cale Duren, beside me, let out the smallest sound I've ever heard from a grown man. Barely a breath, really, barely anything. And I felt the weight of something enormous shift in the air around us. I didn't write anything in my journal for a long time after that. I just watched. That's part one. What happened next, what Cale did, what we learned, what it cost all of us to understand. That's what the rest of this is. But I want you to sit with this image first. A horse that everyone in Millhaven called dangerous, standing perfectly still on a ridge above a town that had decided its past didn't exist, and a woman's hand on its face in the gray light before anyone was awake to see. My uncle used to say that understanding something doesn't make it stop hurting. He was talking about the weather, I think, the way knowing a drought is coming doesn't make your throat any less dry. But I've applied it to most things since and found it surprisingly accurate. Standing on that ridge in the early light of an April morning, watching a woman speak to a horse that had been terrorizing the men of Millhaven for 6 months, I understood something. Not the full shape of it yet, just the outline. Just enough to know that whatever came next was going to require more from me than curiosity. I glanced at Cale. He hadn't moved. His hand was still on my arm, barely there, and his eyes were fixed on the clearing with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. It wasn't exactly surprise. It was more like the face a man makes when something he already suspected turns out to be true, and the confirmation is somehow worse than the uncertainty had been. We stood there for a long time. The sun continued its slow argument with the horizon. The woman continued her low, continuous talking to the roan, and the roan stood with its head lowered, that enormous weight of muscle and bone somehow reduced to something almost tender by the proximity of her hand. Then Cale stepped forward. I grabbed his sleeve. He looked back at me. "She might run," I said, barely a whisper. "She already knows we're here," he said quietly. "Has since we crested the ridge." I looked back at the woman. She hadn't turned. Her hand was still on the horse's face, her voice still running in that low murmur. But something in her posture had shifted, a slight squaring of the shoulders, a change in how her weight sat on her feet. Cale was right, she knew. He moved forward anyway, and I followed because there was no other logical thing to do. And we crossed the clearing toward her the way you cross a space you're not sure you have permission to be in. Carefully, with attention to the sounds our boots made on the rocky ground. She turned when we were about 15 feet away. I am going to try to describe her face accurately because I think the details matter, and I am someone who believes that. She was somewhere in her late 50s, maybe early 60s. Apache, Ende I would learn later, which meant something specific that I didn't fully understand yet. Her hair was black with silver running through it, kept back but loose enough to move in the morning breeze. Her face was deeply lined, not in a way that suggested softness worn away, but in a way that suggested something harder than stone. A face that had been tested repeatedly and had not yielded, but had recorded every test. Her eyes were dark and still, and she looked at us with absolutely no fear, which was, in its way, more frightening than anything she could have said. She was wearing clothing that was partly traditional and partly practical. A blanket around her shoulders against the morning cold, moccasins. A dress of traded cloth that had been patched in 2 places with what looked like flour sacking. She was small. She seemed, standing there in that clearing, to take up exactly as much space as she needed and no more, which is a way of existing in the world that I have always envied. She did not speak first. Cale said something then that I did not expect. He said it quietly, but he said it in a language that was not English and not Spanish and that I did not recognize, and the woman's expression changed. Not dramatically, just a small, fractional tightening around the eyes and then a release, like a held breath. She answered him, also not in English. I stood there, entirely useless, feeling the peculiar humiliation of being fluent in exactly one language, in a situation where that one language was beside the point. They spoke for a minute or two. The roan shifted slightly, watching. I watched the roan. My journal was pressing against my ribs through my shirt pocket, and I had a powerful, almost childlike desire to take it out and write something down just to feel like I was participating. Then Cale turned to me. Her name is Sáhkuu, he said, which roughly means the one who came back. She's Lipan Apache. She's been living up here on this ridge for the better part of 8 months. I looked at the clearing with the fire ring and the rusted iron. Alone. He looked back at her, said something. She answered. Not alone, he translated. She was with her nephew. He died in November. The word died sat in the air. How? I asked. He asked. She answered. He looked at the rocky ground for a moment before he looked back at me. Rancher found him on the lower eastern pasture, Cale said. Said he was stealing feed, shot him. I didn't write anything down. I just stood there with the weight of it. How old was he? Cale asked. She answered. Her voice was flat when she said it, not cold exactly, but the kind of flat that comes from saying a number so many times that it has stopped being able to hurt you through repetition alone. 16, Cale said. His name had been Dáhí. She said it in a way that made clear the name itself was still sacred, still too closely attached to the person it had belonged to for her to say it without weight. He had been the son of her sister, who had died 4 years prior of something she described as a sickness that took fast. Cale thought influenza or possibly typhoid. After the sister died, Dáhí had been in her care. They had come to this ridge because it was ground her people had used. Not always this exact ridge, but this general sweep of eastern hill country, before the relocations and the long bad years. She had come here, she told Cale, because she thought the old land might be safer than the settlements to the east, which had become places of a specific kind of despair that she described in terms I couldn't follow, but that Cale relayed to me as something like, places where you stop knowing who you are. She hadn't been wrong exactly about the safety of the ridge. The Millhaven ranchers mostly ignored the high ground, too rocky for grazing, too inconvenient for anything practical. She and Dáhí had been careful. They'd moved at night when they needed to come down for water. They'd kept the camp dark or near dark. For most of their time on the ridge, no one had known they were there. Then November came. Dáhí had gone down to the eastern pasture at night. Not to steal, she said, though there was a kind of resignation in how she said it, like she expected that to be what we believed regardless. He'd seen feed bags and taken some oats. Not much, enough to matter. The rancher had found him. She didn't know the rancher's name. Cale asked if she'd seen him, and she described a man, heavy-set, red-faced, moved like someone who was always a little angry even when nothing was happening. Cale and I looked at each other across the description. Dunbar. She'd heard the shot from the ridge. She'd known immediately what it was. By the time she came down, Dáhí was at the base of the slope, and he was dead, and the rancher was gone. She had brought the boy back up to the ridge. She had buried him there in the old ground, where she believed the land could hold him properly. And then, in January, she had done something that I found both perfectly comprehensible and completely heartbreaking. She had sent the horse down. The roan wasn't just a wild horse. It had been with her for years. She called it something in Lipan that Cale translated loosely as red dust, and its loyalty to her was of the kind that long partnership between a person and an animal produces, which is different from the loyalty that comes from ownership or training. It knew her. It responded to her. And it was an animal, which meant that its grief and rage didn't have anywhere to put themselves except into action. She'd sent it down at first, she said, not entirely intentionally. She'd been so undone by Dáhí's death in the first weeks that she had stopped managing the horse's movements carefully. And when it sensed her distress, it went down the slope and did what frightened horses do when they've been conditioned to associate a certain kind of human presence with threat. But after the first incident, after Morrow got knocked over, she had watched from the ridge and felt something she described to Cale in words he said he could only approximate, something like witness. like the horse was doing what she couldn't do, saying what she had no voice to say. So she hadn't called it back. She'd watched from up on the ridge while a horse raged on her behalf at the men of Millhaven, and those men had taken it, had flinched from it, had started looking over their shoulders, had started in some small and insufficient way being afraid of something on that ridge. She knew it wasn't justice. She told Cale that directly, and her voice was clear when she said it. She didn't think it was justice. She didn't even think it was right. But it was the only language available to her that those men would hear. I wrote one sentence in my journal when Cale translated that. Then I closed the journal and put it back in my pocket, because some things need to just sit inside you for a while before you start working them into words. We stayed on the ridge for several hours. Cale did most of the talking. In that language I was beginning to understand was Spanish heavily inflected with terms he'd picked up somewhere, supplemented with Lipan Apache words I guessed he'd learned from somewhere in his past that he wasn't volunteering to explain. Sáhkuu tolerated my presence with a kind of elaborate courtesy. She acknowledged me when I was addressed, offered me water from a clay vessel that she produced from the shadow of the outcrop, and otherwise treated me as what I was, a secondary figure in a conversation that wasn't mine. That was fine. I was used to being a secondary figure. I think that's why I record things. What I observed while they talked was this. The camp was more substantial than it had first appeared. There was a lean-to against the larger outcrop, well camouflaged. She'd used scrub brush and cedar boughs and a piece of canvas that had been painted or stained to match the surrounding rock. Inside it were the accumulated materials of 8 months of careful living, dried food stores in clay pots and wrapped cloth, tools made and improvised, blankets, a worn leather bag that seemed to hold personal items she didn't open in front of us. It was not comfortable, exactly. But it was habitable, and it was hers. Near the boy's grave, a low mound of carefully arranged stones a little way from the camp, marked in a way that I will not describe here because I don't think it's mine to describe, she had placed things. Objects. I didn't look long. It wasn't my place to look long. The roan moved around the clearing with proprietorial ease, occasionally nosing at the scrub, occasionally standing very close to Sáhkuu for no apparent reason, like it was checking in. Once it came and stood near me and breathed heavily through its nose in my direction. I stood absolutely still, the way I'd seen Cale do with the spooked mare. The roan sniffed my shoulder, then walked away. Cale, watching this, allowed himself a small smile. "It trusts you a little," he said. "It doesn't know me well enough yet," I said. He looked at me. That's not always how trust works. The conversation turned difficult in the early afternoon. Cale had asked. I'd understood enough of the shape of it, the questioning rise of his voice, something about what she intended to do, what came next, whether she planned to stay on the ridge. Her answer was long. He listened carefully, and when he translated, his voice was steady but the thumb-on-belt movement was going. "She says she doesn't have anywhere to go," he said. "The reservation she was assigned to is, she describes it in terms that roughly translate to a place of forgetting. She doesn't want to go back. Her people who are still there, she says, they're alive but they've stopped being who they were. That's how she says it, not all of them, but enough." I thought about the phrase places where you stop knowing who you are. "She wants to stay here?" I asked. He asked, she answered. "She wants to be where Dáhí is," he said quietly. "She says she's not planning to leave his grave for anyone." That landed the way it was meant to, not dramatically, just as a fact, stated with the particular clarity of someone who has made peace with a decision. Then she added something, and Cale's expression shifted. "She also says," he said, "that she knows who shot him. She's known since it happened. She watched the man from the ridge the next morning going about his work. She knows his name. She says she's not going to do anything about it because she's an old woman alone on a ridge and she knows what the outcome of that would be. But she wants someone to know. She says she's wanted someone to know for 8 months, and she didn't think anyone from this town was ever going to come up and ask." I opened my journal. She watched me open it. She watched my pen move. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said something to Cale. He almost smiled. "She wants to know what you're writing." I told him. He told her. Her expression didn't change much, but something shifted in her eyes. A very small, private thing, like a door opening a crack in a room you hadn't known was locked. She nodded once, just once. "She says," Cale told me, "that she hopes you're a careful writer." Tell her I try to be, I said. He told her. She made a sound that might have been the first edge of something like humor. We came down the ridge in the late afternoon, with the long gold light of a Texas spring day turning the scrub-covered hillside into something almost beautiful. I didn't speak for a long way. Cal didn't push. When we got back to the horses, he stood for a moment, his hand resting on his horse's neck, looking back up the slope. Dunbar, I said. It wasn't really a question. Yeah, he said. You knew him from the description. Didn't need the description, he said. I know the type, met 1,000 of them in every town I've worked. What do we do? I asked. He was quiet for long enough that I started to think he wasn't going to answer. Then, I don't know yet, he said. I know what should happen, I'm not sure what can happen, those aren't the same list. I thought about Sáhkuu on the ridge with her lean-to and her stones and her horse, and a grave she was never going to leave. I thought about Dáhí, 16 years old in the dark of an eastern pasture. I thought about Dunbar at Hannigan's, talking loud about the horse like it was the most interesting thing to happen to Millhaven in months. She's been trying to get us to look at the ridge for 8 months, I said, sending the horse down, hoping someone would follow it up instead of just getting out of the way. Cal looked at me. Yeah, he said again, that's about right. I wrote in my journal that night for a long time, pages and pages. I wrote down everything I could remember about her face, her camp, the way the roan stood near the grave. I wrote down what Cal had told me, and I wrote down the things I was feeling that I didn't have clean names for. One thing I wrote, and then stared at for a long time before I closed the book. She sent the horse because she didn't have a voice we'd hear, and we came up the ridge because the horse got our attention, and now I know. The question is what knowing is worth. That question kept me awake most of the night. The answer came the following week, but not in any form I would have predicted. There is a specific kind of reckoning that comes when you know something that most people around you don't, and the knowing is the kind that carries obligation. Not the comfortable sort of knowing, an interesting fact, a useful piece of information. The other kind. The kind where remaining quiet makes you complicit in something. I had been writing in this journal for 15 years. I had filled 23 of them. I had recorded droughts and deaths and small moments of beauty and large moments of cruelty, and I had told myself that recording was its own form of witness, its own form of responsibility. That had been easy to believe when the things I was recording were sufficiently removed from my ability to act. When the suffering was historical or distant or belonged to people I couldn't reach. The night after we came down from the ridge, I sat in the bunkhouse with my journal and understood, in a way that felt almost physical, that I had been lying to myself. Writing something down is not the same as doing something about it, and I had confused those two things for 15 years because the confusion was convenient. Cal came to find me the next morning before breakfast. He sat down on the bunkhouse steps beside me, and for a minute didn't say anything, just looked at the early light on the Keever barn while I finished my coffee. I've been thinking, he said. I figured, I said. The legal question is, he paused, started over. Dunbar's a property owner in good standing. Dáhí was on his land at night. In Texas in 1884, a man who shoots someone on his property in the dark has more protection from consequence than, he stopped again. Than a dead Apache boy, I said. He nodded slowly, like the nod cost something. That's not justice, I said. No, it's not, but it's what I'm working with. I thought about Sáhkuu's voice when she'd said she wasn't going to do anything. The resignation in it that wasn't defeat so much as accuracy. A precise assessment of available options and available power, stripped of wishful thinking. She's not asking for legal justice, I said. She didn't ask us for anything, she just wanted someone to know. Cal was quiet for a while. Knowing isn't nothing, he said finally. It's also not enough, I said. He looked at me sideways. What would enough look like? I didn't answer right away. I'd been thinking about it since the night before, and I still didn't have a clean answer. What I had was a list of insufficient things, and one idea that felt both small and potentially important. She said she wants to stay where Dáhí is, I said. She's alone up there. She's going to freeze in the first hard winter, or run out of food before that. She's survived 8 months. Spring and summer, I said. She hasn't survived a winter yet. He was quiet again, the thumb on belt. He was thinking. "There's that small stone house on the eastern edge of the Kiever property," I said. "Nobody uses it. Old line shack. Kiever keeps meaning to tear it down." Cal looked at me. "She wouldn't leave the ridge," I said. "Not permanently, but if there was somewhere she could go when it's bad, somewhere close enough to the grave that she could get back easily." "You'd have to ask Kiever," Cal said. "I know," I said. "And he'd have to say yes." "I know that too." Cal picked up a small stone from the step and turned it over in his hand. Set it down. "What about Dunbar?" he said. That was the question I'd been circling all night. Not avoiding it exactly, more the way you circle a fire to find the right place to approach it. Too close too fast and you get burned. Too much distance and you just get cold. "There are things you can do legally," I said carefully, "and things that don't require law. Like making sure people in Millhaven know what happened," I said. "Not accusing, not making a claim we can't support formally. Just making sure it's known, making sure Dunbar lives in a town where the people around him know what he did." Cal looked at me for a long time. "You think that matters?" "I think it's the only kind of consequence I can actually make real," I said. "I think it's not nothing. And I think she should get to decide whether it's enough." He sat with that. "You'd put your name to it," he said, "if you told people." "Yes," I said. "You're a hired hand who's been here 6 months." "I know. Dunbar has friends in this town." "I know that too." He turned the idea over the way he'd turned the stone, looking at all its sides. Then he stood up. "Let's go talk to Kiever," he said. Kiever was not a simple man, but he was a direct one, which is often more useful. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his second coffee and his account book when we came in, and he looked up at us with the expression of a man who could tell by the way two people walked through a door whether what was coming was going to be complicated. "Sit down," he said before we'd said anything. We sat. I let Cal do most of the talking. He was better at it. He had a way of presenting things without oratory, just clear, straight fact laid out in order, which is how Kiever preferred to receive information. He told him about the ridge, about Sáhkuu, about Dáhí, about November. Kiever didn't interrupt. He held his coffee cup but didn't drink from it. His wife came into the kitchen partway through and stopped and listened, and he didn't send her away. When Cal finished, Kiever was quiet for a moment. "Dunbar," he said, not a question. "That's our read," Cal said. "We can't prove it in a court." Kiever turned his coffee cup slowly on the table. "Pete Dunbar and I have not been friendly for about 15 years, he said. "He pushed his eastern fence line over onto my land in 1869. I took it to the county seat and won, but he never forgave me for it." "That's not why we're here," Cal said carefully. "I know it isn't," Kiever said. "I'm just telling you I have no particular inclination to protect the man." He looked at his wife. Some kind of wordless communication passed between them that I recorded in my journal later, but am still not sure I fully understood. "The line shack," Mrs. Kiever said. Kiever looked back at us. "You're thinking the line shack." "If she'd use it," Cal said. "We can't make her, she'd have to agree." Kiever set his coffee cup down. "It needs a new roof on the eastern corner." "I'll get that sorted." He said it like that, and that was it, and I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't known was tight. We went back up to the ridge 2 days later. The roan watched us come up from about 100 yards off. I watched it watch us. There was a different quality to its attention than there had been the first time, less focused aggression, more assessment, like it was trying to decide what we were now that we'd come back. Sáhkuu was at the fire circle when we crested. She looked up without particular surprise, like she'd been expecting us, like she'd made some calculation about people who came back. Cal presented everything, the line shack, the Kiever offer. The conditions. She was not obligated to leave the ridge. The shack was there if she needed it, particularly through winter, and she would be considered in no way an intruder on Kiever land for the purpose of accessing it or the water source nearby. She listened without interrupting. Her face was very still. When he finished, she was quiet for a while. The roan moved close behind her. I'd come to understand this as a habitual positioning, the horse physically anchoring itself near her when it sensed tension or uncertainty. She said something. Cal listened. She says," he paused, finding the translation. "She says she knows what you're doing. She says it won't bring Dáhí back, and she's not going to pretend it will, and she needs you to know she's not going to thank you for it the way you might expect." "Tell her I don't expect that," I said. "He did," she answered. "She says she knows," he said. He was almost smiling. "She says she can tell." Then she looked at me directly, not a Cale at me, and said something short. "She wants to know what you're going to write," he said. I thought about it for a moment, about all the ways I could answer that, about what I was committed to doing. "Tell her I'm going to write what happened," I said. "What actually happened, starting with a boy named Dáhí who was 16 years old and didn't deserve to die in a dark pasture, and ending with whatever ending this gets." Cale translated. She listened. She didn't answer right away. She looked at me for a long time. Then she reached into the leather bag at her side and took out something small, a piece of worked leather etched with a pattern I didn't recognize, attached to a thin cord. She held it out to me. I looked at Cale. He gave me nothing, just waited. I took it. It was small in my palm. The etching was fine-line, geometric, the kind of work that takes patience and a very steady hand. She said something. "She says it belonged to Dáhí," Cale said. His voice was careful. "She says she wants someone who writes things down to have it." I held it and I didn't speak, and I didn't write anything down, because I was incapable of doing either one for a moment. Then I closed my hand around it and I said, "Thank you," and I meant it in every direction. I kept my other promise over the following days, carefully, without confrontation, without accusation, without giving Dunbar anything he could use as a formal claim against me. I told what I knew in the way that true things can sometimes be told, conversationally, quietly, in the places where information moved through Millhaven, at Hannigan's, at the South Water Pump where the morning workers gathered, in the spaces between tasks where men talked about things that weren't the immediate task. I told it as something I'd come to understand, not something I was claiming to prove. I went up on the eastern ridge. There's a woman up there, Apache, been there since last fall. Her nephew was shot on the Dunbar Eastern pasture in November, 16 years old. I watched the faces when I said it. I watched what happened in the eyes of men who'd been happy to talk about the roan horse as a straightforward nuisance, and who now had to locate the nuisance in a larger story that was less comfortable. I can't tell you justice happened. It didn't, not in any formal sense. Dunbar was never charged. He was never brought before any court. He continued to work his property and to be red-faced and loud at Hannigan's and to know exactly what he'd done, and to carry that in whatever way a person carries the thing they've done when they've told themselves it was justified. But Millhaven knew. That's a small thing. I know it's a small thing. I told you at the start that understanding doesn't make it stop hurting, and I meant it in both directions. Sáhkuu used the line shack for the first time in late October, when the nights got genuinely cold and the ridge became a harder place to survive. She came and went on her own schedule. The Keevers left food near the shack sometimes, not conspicuously, not in a way that required acknowledgement, and sometimes it was gone and sometimes it wasn't. The roan stopped coming down into the valley. Not immediately. There were 2 more incidents in the weeks following our visit to the ridge, both involving riders moving along the base of the eastern slope, and both times the roan appeared and made its intentions clear before being recalled. I watched one of them. The horse came halfway down the slope, stopped, looked at the rider, and then stood very still. The rider didn't know what to do. The roan held that position for a long time, and then it turned and went back up. Not a charge, not the same thing as before, more like a statement. I wrote it down. The horse is still speaking. It's just changed the vocabulary. By winter, the incidents had stopped entirely. Cale left Millhaven in early December, when his hired work with the Keevers concluded. We said goodbye at the barn in the gray morning cold, and I shook his hand and found I didn't have anything that felt like the right words for what he'd done, which was to be the kind of person who follows a horse up a ridge when everyone else is busy being afraid of it. He knew I was looking for words. He put his hand on my shoulder briefly. "Write it well," he said. That was all. I still have the piece of leather that Sáhkuu gave me. It rides in my journal's inner pocket now, alongside the journal itself, which has become its habit. I've thought a lot about the shape of this story, whether it has won, whether I have a right to call it that. It belongs to Sáhkuu in a way I can only approximate from the outside. It belongs to Dáhí in a way nobody can access anymore. It belongs to Cale in some way he'd probably decline if I tried to hand it to him directly. What I have is my record of it, my outside-looking-in witness account, the specific quality of the light on that first morning on the ridge, the way the roan turned its head when she spoke, the very small sound Cale made when he saw her hand on the horse's face. Barely anything, barely a breath. But I heard it and I wrote it down, and I'm not going to let it disappear. Last spring I went back up to the ridge, on my own just to go. The camp was there, the grave stones were there, tended. The scrub around the grave had been pulled back, kept clear. A few small objects I hadn't noticed before had been placed there. I still didn't look long, but they were there. I sat for a while in the clearing where the fire ring was. The morning was quiet. Down below, I could see the eastern edge of the Millhaven pastures, small from that distance, looking almost peaceful. I thought about what it costs a person to make themselves so alone. To choose a ridge over the places that have people, because the places with people have stopped being safe. To send a horse down into a valley to carry your rage and your grief, because there is no other form those things can take. I thought about Dáhí, who I never met and who I never will. I opened my journal and I wrote his name at the top of a clean page. Not because I was starting a new entry. Just because I wanted his name to be in there in the middle of everything else, the way a real person's name should be.